I think that we have to have global governance, meaning I think we have to have governance at the scale we affect stuff.
Experts say that we have until 2030 to avoid catastrophe.
If you try to say, fuck, we don't want these dystopic things, so we want to stop authoritarian tech, we want to decentralize and democratize technological capabilities, then we get more collective action failures and decentralized catastrophic tech. If you're like, fuck, we don't want this, we want some surveillance on this and whatever, then we get more dystopic tech. So I would say that we are seeking a third attractor that is neither catastrophes or dystopias. Seems like a pretty fair starting place for how do we design a civilization that is desirable, or at least allows us to continue to advance on the meaningful questions of what a desirable civilization is.
Alex, just how dangerous is a one world government?
I'm sick of leftist, and I'm sick of BlackRock, and I'm sick of the New World Order.
Sorry, I mean the other Alex.
Well, one world government and globalism are pretty charged terms. What we really need is some kind of system at the scale of our global problems. We're already hurtling down a dangerous path where the incentives of individuals and nations conflict with our collective well-being, an issue that we call the Metacrisis. Examples of this Metacrisis include nuclear proliferation, bioweapons, climate change, and even the horrible experience that is dating apps. We've tried solving these issues with centralized authorities, which results in corruption. We've tried solving this with decentralized authority, like democracy, which results in inefficiency. So what we really need is what Daniel Schmachtenberger calls a third attractor, a system that combines the best of both centralized and decentralized authority to fix the underlying landscape of incentives.
Yeah, and the purpose of the episode is to see if a third attractor system in the form of a one world government or something like it is even possible. Like, can we develop a concrete vision of this thing, something we can all aspire to, knowing full well that it's just a thought experiment and only a single component of much broader societal changes that must take place in order to solve the meta crisis. And this includes things like culture, education, economics, media. And so if we indeed are able to develop such a system, then in theory, we should be able to reverse engineer a transition to it. But first, we need to understand why the existing systems, like the United Nations, are so ineffective. And to help us answer that question, we turn to our very own world-renowned geopolitical expert, Andrey.
Geopolitical expert and amateur conspiracy theorist. I think that, when everybody thinks world one government, when Alex Jones talks about one world government, it's often in reference to the United Nations or its predecessor, the League of Nations. The UN is not positioned to address any form of the meta crisis as we talk about it. Largely, this is because of gridlock and inaction. The UN has competing interests from different countries that are member states that gets in the way of concerted action to resolve a problem. So think about last Monday, they finally passed urge for a ceasefire in Gaza. This doesn't have any teeth. It took them 4 times to pass this resolution. This resolution is in effect, but there's no way to actually force a ceasefire into the current war between Israel and Palestine. Now, certain organizations like the Universal Postal Union, the Telecommunications Union, the Red Cross, they're smaller, they're focused, they're able to address their objectives accordingly. But the most successful example I think we have of an international government would be something like the Catholic Church, where there is a single spiritual purpose guided by a single authority, the Pope, that's able to effectively drive action on the global stage. So I think that's kind of what we need to think about when we think about world government. How do we create a system that you can resolve some of these compounding crises we're facing as humanity? Hey, everybody, this is Andrey with my co-host Levon. Hope you're enjoying this new series that Radius of Reason is running called Solutions to the Meta Crisis.
Today, we're trying to see if we can actually develop an international coordination system that is able to address the set of interconnected catastrophic risks.
If you enjoy our work and you want to support us, please make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, And leave us a comment. Let us know if you think that an international organization would ever be able to address humanity's problems.
Do you not think that the Catholic Church is still sort of a top-down system when you factor in that it is based around the premise of an omnipotent God, and this idea of punishments, and it's kind of instead of being external, it's kind of internalized.
Right.
I don't know how we would ever achieve that level of kind of unity and dedication in the absence of a religious framework.
Yeah, I think that's the brilliance of the Catholic Church, is that the consequence is eternal damnation too. But you have like a higher spiritual power that will punish you that if you don't act in accordance to their principles. And that really resolves, I think, the collective action problem that you have with the UN. It takes away a lot of that gridlock. And maybe the best approach to building a one world government or a third attractor is to do it through the framework of religion, because you really have the ultimate cudgel, the ultimate series of consequences there. I think that the lessons we can draw from the Catholic Church, to be pragmatic and practical, is less so on the spiritual element, more so on the common understood objectives that the organization has. Especially if you think about the Catholic Church in the era of mercantilism, of colonization, they had this spiritual mission, this calling to spread the faith to the quote unquote newly discovered Americas at the time. Everybody knew what the objective was. Everybody knew what the steps were that were necessary to achieve those objectives. And they were successful.
Spread the faith through what means is maybe that's a good question.
Peaceful hand-holding, yoga, and martinis after hours.
I've always been sympathetic to the idea that religion is an effective framework in certain ways, and I'm specifically sympathetic to the idea that we need to somehow leverage the thinking of religion to solve our biggest problems. As a big advocate of secular spirituality, that's always been important to me. However, we have to think about the downsides of the Catholic Church. Number one, chief of which is that it's wrong. That's a bit of a glaring issue with the Catholic Church, is that it's factually incorrect and therefore rests on shaky, flawed foundations. And then there's the secondary issue that's more relevant to the current conversation, and it's a very centralized authority, prone to corruption and abuse. So what I think might be most useful about religion is that it's an excellent packaging of narrative thinking. For whatever reason, humans think in stories, and that's why religion is so compelling. It gives you a story. I think any secular religion, quote unquote, would need to somehow leverage narrative thinking in the most literal sense of having a plot progression that people find themselves able to identify with.
I think I'm going to push back a little bit on this point about the Catholic Church being specifically centralized. I think that was very much the case when the influence of Catholicism was limited to Europe. I mean, around the time of like the collapse of the Roman Empire. But as the world grew more complex and distributed, the Vatican still plays as like the ultimate guiding force for arbitration, like on setting the stage for how the church should think about some issues like same-sex marriage. But the execution of it, I think the brilliance of it is the fact that you do have a very well-distributed network of self-sustaining cells within communities that are able to adapt accordingly to the unique nuances of being a practicing Catholic in the Philippines versus in California. And that is something that the United Nations is not able to do. I mean, they have these informal UN chapters that spring up across cities all over the world where people can kind of get together and discuss the topics du jour that the United Nations are facing down. Something like sustainable development goals. Every year they kind of declare it like, oh, it's the year of, women voting more. And these organizations at a local level are able to discuss it, but it doesn't have that like the necessary kick in the ass that I think the organizational structure of Catholicism has, where there is somebody that says, okay, as an organization, this is our position on X, Y, and Z, but then it allows the nuanced kind of distribution of that message, which makes it successful, I think.
That's a fair take, Andre, and I think let's be clear about the UN just real quick. It is a mere facade of coordination. And there's so much corruption, right? That its inefficacy is it's just it's not even fair to say it's ineffective. It's just a theater, right? It's not even almost pretending to be effective. If you guys are enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit subscribe, like, and comment. Andre, what do you think about how the show is going thus far?
I think we're having a lovely conversation. I think we are proving the reason for why we need to have the Illuminati control everything.
Last point about the Catholic Church for me is that I guess this is just a matter of levels of abstraction. Like the Catholic Church as a religion may indeed be decentralized in the sense that you can call yourself a Catholic or create a Catholic church pretty easily anywhere without having to do too much pandering to the Vatican. But those individual cells, the system of organization that they use, are going to be centralized. Like there's a priest, there's a leadership team that decide what happens, and that's really the system that I'm referring to. Is that the to whatever extent the Catholic organizations are effective, they are centralized. To at whatever level of abstraction they are operating on, whether that's the local cell, a regional cell, nationwide cell, to whatever extent they want to actually do things, the systems they use are centralized systems.
I think, Alex, and I think the bigger point actually here is the Catholic Church is limited in terms of what it's even trying to achieve, right? It's not trying to solve geopolitics, right? And so by its nature, it seems to work better for what it's doing, but the scale of its reach is inherently limited. If you were to apply the same structure in order to achieve the goals that the UN is trying to achieve, I think you would find massive problems, right?
Well, I mean, I think that's kind of the problem too, is that maybe this is a greater commentary on how the greater kind of human civilization has evolved in the past 300 years, where, I mean, what is the calling of the United Nations? I think it's just as lost as the Catholic Church to a certain extent. I mean, and this is where I think the purpose of this episode really is that the problems that we're facing down are so complex that the UN can't just say, oh, we're going to address climate change as our exclusive functional purpose, because it's going to require a massive organizational lift. And I think because the UN is far more maybe democratic than let's say an autocratic internationalist model, which I suppose the Catholic Church are going to be the best example we have of it. You have this lack of organizational capacity to actually bring about an effective response to something like climate change.
Since we're on the topic of critiquing existing systems, would this be a good time to critique democracy?
Oh, my man's coming through hard. Go for it.
So
we're not endorsing Donald Trump, by the way. This is not a podcast endorsement for anybody in 2020.
Let me rewrite my notes real quick. Oops. So, to be clear, democracy has done a lot of good. It's definitely better than pretty much every other system we have tried in the past. However, it has a number of issues, which most people intuitively understand, but it bears spelling out. For one thing, there's the issue of short-term thinking. when you have elections where everyone gets a vote, and you end up in this system where people are incentivized to vote for people who make them feel good in the moment. That results in the entire population thinking in very short time spans, where we need to think in very, very large time spans. Then there's also the issue of elections, where politicians are incentivized to win elections and not make the world a better place, resulting in the classic problem of spending the bulk of their time in office campaigning or sucking up to lobbyists. So those are a couple of the major issues with democracy. There have been a number of attempts to fix this, but it's very much an inherent problem with democracy. Would either of you add anything to that criticism of democracy?
Did you? I'm zoned out for just a second. Did you mention the issue of transparency?
Indirectly, there's the issue of lobbyists and controlling politicians through the incentives of elections.
Yeah, let's kind of. I think it would be a good time to focus on a systems view of things. So
Yeah.
you talk about lobbying, right? And this is a symptom of what's called the success to the successful trap. And this comes from the fact that as as wealthy people gain more and more wealth, they're able to more or less bend the rules in their favor. And then you get this feedback loop that emerges where that allows them to have even more wealth and power and thereby continue to frame the law and the incentives in their favor, and it just becomes this compounding problem. And so the way that you can escape this is, well, there's a couple of ways. I mean, we talked about transparency. If people actually know what's going on, then they can actually take action to try to stop that or reverse that. Another way is it's kind of what we try to do with monopolies in the private industry is antitrust laws. But you could do so in the case of like individuals through like an inheritance tax. And of course, then the question arises, well, why we don't want the government to spend our money, but I think there's very creative ways you could reorchestrate that. For example, not letting the government necessarily dictate that, but putting it up for vote on what issues that we want to fund resolutions for, and having that be maybe a democratic process or a process that is not directly tied to the government. You're in a sense creating redundancies that make it harder and harder to have a corrupted centralized authority to take advantage of those assets. So I don't know. There's just a couple of examples, but maybe we can think a little bit more about some of the main takeaways, say from the Catholic Church that Andrey mentioned. You talked about decentralization and how the local kind of expressions of the Catholic Church are able to have some flexibility for their given environment. You mentioned the councils that they can form, right, to kind of adjust certain doctrines. I think that ability to adapt and to be flexible and evolve, just like, the Constitution, for example, the U.S. Constitution has the ability to amend it.
In theory.
That is absolutely, what was that?
In theory.
Yeah, in theory. But that is absolutely vital to any new system that we form. Nassim Taleb, in his book Anti-Fragile, talks about how constancy is what creates fragility, right? And so one aspect actually that we can look at in terms of the Catholic Church is the fact that they are anchored to the Bible, right? And so that piece of constancy is what can lead to its own fragility when it comes to certain ideas. For example, like they didn't want people in Africa to use condoms, I think, or was that all over the world? I can't remember.
It's probably
But
all
they were
over the world. I don't know.
I think it was
They're against condoms in general.
Yeah, it's not just
maybe
like
they were, yeah.
But it definitely hurts developing nations most.
I think it hurt people in Africa the most. From maybe that's where I got that from. But I mean, things like that. So the ability to be adaptive is an absolutely crucial component. Again, when it comes to lobbying and the issue of transparency, I think any new system has to be literally as transparent as possible, minus like, okay, there's things that are important for national security. Okay, we get that. And it becomes a gray area where, how one defines what is for national security. But there is no question that the current system we have, again, say in the United States, is far too opaque. There is just no question that this is the case. And I think the same is true for corporations. The general principle here isn't whether it's government or corporations; it's who has power. We need to know. We need to know. We need to know the flow of money. In those cases.
This goes back to the issues of centralized authority. Like the centralized authority model doesn't have to be one of government. It can be any single entity or group of entities with power, for sure.
I think, and maybe we're just bringing up the Catholic Church all episode long because it's Easter Sunday and we're trying to be culturally relevant. The most important element of the Catholic Church as an institution that kind of influenced my thinking of why it even needed to be brought up in this conversation is the fact that the Catholic Church is inherently detached from national interest. That's the way in which it operates to a certain extent more effectively than the United Nations in achieving its objectives, is that there isn't, at least on a clear level of decision making, the inherent rivalry and tension that you will have on the UN Security Council between, let's say, the United States and China when it comes to voting on an issue. And the ability to rise above national interest is very, very important when dealing with questions of an existential nature, because you're not going to politicize something which is accepted as a given within your organization. And
here's a problem with that, Andre.
Yeah.
You're just kind of reframing the tribal lines. You're changing it from national borders to now it's actually religious borders, right? So they're just changing that frame. And so they have the same problem when it comes to different religious beliefs.
They do.
And so you would have conflict and failures of conflict resolution occur in that space as opposed to, international coordination
precisely.
efforts.
But if we have a blank whiteboard and we are sketching out the frameworks of some form of international entity that will be able to effectively address the Metacrisis, we're going to take the best elements of these systems and try to incorporate them, right? So, we're not going to, create edicts that will cause like strife between different religions or different groups of people. I think, okay, you're correct in that the Catholic Church does sort of revert back to this kind of tribal tension, but in its elimination of other tribes, it would become the unifying force for everybody, right? Like either you bend or you.
That's the Islamic principle, right?
Right.
Like,
maybe Islam is what's going to save us
submission.
from the Metacrisis. We all, convert. We're all lockstep. We resolve all that bullshit.
Well, that's
that's
really
clip.
Interesting.
That's the clip for the episode.
Hold on. That's really interesting actually, because you can apply a lot of what Andre is saying to like Islam, and like if it does, manage to kind of
achieve its
continue
objective.
to grow and it could achieve some sort of harmony through pure subjugation. But no, I do agree with some of those general points, Andre, and I think we have to make sure we don't minimize, and we always keep it as a top priority of whatever new system that we have. But we have to maintain some sort of cultural unity, shared values. This is something that you see in the United States right now is causing massive, massive problems, right? In a span of decades, our values have been more or less pulled apart, kind of bubbleized, maybe that's if I can use that word. And you're seeing the ramifications of that in culture. Democracy cannot function in any capacity when you have a complete lack of harmony in terms of what you view as true and what you view in terms of what is actually valuable, right? So it's kind of two things going on at once there. So whatever this new system is, it must provide some sort of continual attraction towards a set of shared values. Of course, this is very dangerous, and it goes back to that dynamic of how do you create this sort of efficacy without too much centralization and consolidation of power.
Yeah, how do you create a set of values that people can agree on without falling into the trap of constancy that Nassim Taleb warns against?
But I think you have to create an organization that attracts individuals to it based on their shared values, right? I think if you set the baseline at we're trying to resolve climate change, for instance, right? Like we're maybe the base value is we're trying to resolve the end of humanity. And as an organization, we accept that the end of humanity will be brought about by the series of problems we're facing. So that is the operating standard for everything that's going to be done, is to eliminate and or prepare ourselves for to address these sorts of crises, right? And that will, by like reason of existence, attract individuals that believe that those things are a threat to humanity. And I don't think it would be a wise use of time to try to convert somebody to your cause. I think you have to maximize attracting individuals that already believe in your cause by nature of who they are.
I think that's a valid point to make, but I'm afraid that we're getting a little too close to how do we transition to this system versus what would the system actually look like once it's in place. Not that, again, it is important. The transition has to be realistic. It has to be possible. But I think there's also, I can start launching, objections to what you said and say, in order to, just real quick, because this can totally get out of hand. But if you're trying to convert people to your cause, you have to still fix some of these multipolar traps where you've got the corporations that, the oil corporations that are funding anti-climate change propaganda. And so you're not trying to gain attraction to these values and ideas through a free market of ideas, because there's so many perverse incentives around just around that market. Does that make sense?
If I may interject, I think it's still valuable to figure out what are the shared values that the system is going to be based on. We don't necessarily have to figure out what our PR and marketing plan is going to be for getting people on board with these values, but I think it's still important to figure out what they're going to be. I think the idea of having a very broad value system that the maximum number of people can be on board with is useful, like the flourishment of humanity. And then also some other kind of meta value, like the value of flexibility, the value of recursion, the value of modification, the value of good epistemics. I think having that as a foundational value that is really important as well. That way you can avoid having a value system that falls into the constancy trap. You have a meta value system that promotes its own modification.
Yeah, that is absolutely spot on. And one of those values should absolutely be that you should never be tied down to any system, any paradigm in and of itself.
All values are subject to revision except for this one.
Well, yeah,
Right.
I mean, my only pushback is that again, you would be replicating a lot of like the bureaucratic crisis that some of these like supranational organizations face, where if you don't have a rigid baseline to start with that could be flexible in its maybe approach to issues, but you have to have a firm foundation to at least provide that initial organizing structure. And if all of that's fluid and there's always debate over, hey, what is good, what is bad, what is more effective, you're just going to get back to the problem of gridlock. I
What
think you
if? Sorry, go ahead,
no
Andre.
the
No,
gridlock is the
what
point I was
if
trying to make. Yeah.
what if you address that issue of values through the inherent systemic processes? So what Alex is saying is you've got this sort of recursive model of like these are the values, and these values recursively maintain or enhance the system's kind
Right.
of function according to those values. So you maintain that closed loop, which is in its own favor. Um, but then part of um, part of that system is actually the ability to make decisions on those more rigid or more concrete, let's say more concrete values, right? So like maybe what's a war crime, or you
Yeah.
know things of that nature.
Carbon capture is a
Yeah.
useful thing to do.
And I think so, and I think this is where we can start to propose the more concrete ideas that we've discussed. And Andre, I know kind of along the lines that you want to go, which is the more bottom up approach. I think the model that Alex and I have talked about is more of, it's not as bottom up as what you have suggested, but I think it's more of like a simultaneous like bottom and top coming together type of thing. And the core feature of this involves a sort of draft mechanism to actually elect members in order to make decisions. And what we've termed this, what we've coined as a term for this thing is called the meta treaty model. And before I get too deep into it, I want to say what inspired it, and what was the inspiration is the Montreal Protocol, which, as we discussed in our last Metacrisis episode, was a treaty that aimed to address the ozone depletion crisis that
Right.
happened in the late 80s.
Right.
And so the Montreal Protocol, the reason that it was even kind of agreed upon by all relevant parties was because the evidence was so overwhelming that we were absolutely trashing that, that ozone layer. And in fact, one of the best features of the Montreal Protocol was that it had a stipulation in there that if things were getting worse, they would meet again. I can't recall if it was kind of mandatory after like 3 years or so, but they met again after 3 years. So the Montreal Protocol was originally formed in 1987, and then in 1990 there was what was called the London Agreement, which is when they reconvened and saw, oh shit, actually, the goals that we set are not nearly sufficient. The ozone is still being depleted at a rate that's far too rapid, and also there's all these extra chemicals, not just the chlorofluorocarbons, whatever. That were producing these things, producing this impact. So they came to this London Agreement, and they basically agreed upon more stringent rules and regulations, and that totally curbed the ozone depletion issue to the point of, I believe, reversing it. So this is an example of, well, actually, we can have some sort of international coordination that overcomes corporate interest. Like, this is a solid historical fact of us doing this thing. And I believe that any sort of treaty, again, I don't want to talk about transitions just yet, but any sort of meta treaty that we're going to sign on these huge global issues, AI, climate change, they're probably going to have to come after there's a very stark realization of the dangers, right? It's just not going to happen otherwise. So
But
let's
I mean, let me
put that out
quickly
there.
let me quickly ask you to clarify that, right? What realization of the dangers are we going to get that's not already present? Like, what kind of symbol or sign is going to push people into acting, or maybe not people, push nation states into acting on this in a concentrated manner that are not already present? And I think that in itself is the issue, is that all of the problems are there. All of the evidence is there.
I disagree.
Okay.
I think it's the severity of the problems. I think they're just not severe enough. I think
the country of the Seychelles is like vanishing off the face of the earth. Like, we're having the first. I mean, I think it's easier to talk about the meta-crisis when we start framing into things like climate change, because that's kind of a clear issue that we can point to that might have a level of inaction behind it, right? But we're starting to witness climate refugees, for instance, right? People leaving their homelands because you can't live there anymore. Either the sea levels are rising to a certain point, or Alex, sorry, what you were going to say?
Yeah. You're absolutely right. The evidence is all there, except for the fact it's a kind of evidence that makes a interesting news headline, but it doesn't hit the day-to-day operations of both individuals and governments, like
corporations. More importantly,
corporations, supply chain shortages, famines, more pandemics, stuff like that impacts the bottom line. That's the kind of thing that we'd have to see.
And let me give you a concrete example, Andre.
Yeah.
Let me just give you, like, when it comes to bioweapons, the moment that there is a bioengineered pandemic, and I'm not talking about COVID.
Oh no!
So in addition to COVID,
as demonstrated by Alex Jones' research,
Papa bless.
But like, that's a concrete example of, like, that's going to be an oh shit moment. AI drones that go fucking totally nuts and start killing like random people. That could definitely be an oh shit moment. Mass migration out of India, mass famine, killing tens of millions of people, which is entirely possible given some of the climate projections and the impact on agriculture.
Nuclear exchange.
I think all of these things, I think
nuclear exchange. Yep.
It would just be too late. I think with the it's the Montreal Protocol, correct? Is that the?
Yeah.
So with the Montreal Protocol, we had the benefit of organizing a response when it was still possible to enact a level of change to reduce the rate at which the ozone layer was being depleted, right? So there was at least wiggle room. All of the harbingers you're kind of pointing out are like, the second an AI drone loses its shit and starts like icing people, that's too late. Like that's not something we can
Andre,
walk back
but
on.
It's a needle you're threading here, because you're absolutely right. With exponential technology, it is too late to act by the time the cat's out of the bottle,
right?
Or out of the bag, whatever the fuck that is.
The genie cat.
I don't know how you got a cat in the bottle,
but damn it, it's out.
PETA is furious.
Just dropped their sponsorship. Yeah,
but it's like, I'm talking about. This is going to be on a spectrum, right? I really don't think things are going to happen overnight. And you talk about like bioengineered pandemic. Like, it's possible that there is a bioengineered pandemic that does a lot of destruction, but it's on the scale of COVID and not something that could be, let's say, far worse. Because yes, if it is that 100x COVID type pandemic, then it is too late. But if it's not, then we have a chance. In the same way, when you talk about climate change, tens of millions of people starving in India is horrible, but it's not the end of the world, and it might still provide us an opportunity to provide some sort of mitigation. And when it comes to climate change, to be very clear, we are past that breaking point. It's all mitigation now. Like, there is we're already past that point. So if you look at some of the projections, some of the more extreme projections, 4 degrees Celsius by 2100, that's roughly 7-8 degrees Fahrenheit, and in some low, when you start to map that out into certain areas, given some of the actual fluctuation there, you're looking at, again, massive issues with agriculture, massive political instability, sea level rise, like mass migrations, like all these things are kind of, it becomes a feedback loop that becomes very problematic. But again, if we catch it early enough or we start to coordinate, that might prevent that feedback loop from totally going out of control. Like you can introduce a sort of what the systems thinkers call a balancing feedback loop.
If I may offer a more optimistic possibility, well, I do think the pessimistic view is probably the more likely one. There's not a whole lot we can do except wait for a catastrophe. In the optimistic take, the thing that could spur nation states to act is that bottom-up approach that we briefly touched on, and that would require a cultural enlightenment of some kind, which also requires us to figure out what the guiding principles of the system are going to be, which we can then propagate throughout culture. And once culture is on board with those same values, the system itself will naturally bubble up.
I think we have to, in any form of organizing in this kind of model, be it, again, I favor the bottom-up approach, but we have to leave the current bounds of the nation-state system. Because I think the current system as it's set up, Alex, you were touching on this, is fully co-opted and dominated by the interests of corporations and financial institutions. And those organizations will not willingly put caps on things like AI deployment. It's just like no company based on a shareholder model is going to forsake the revenues that AI, for instance, could bring about. And my position is that those types of organizations would never support membership or participation in an effective manner by nation states into this kind of international organization.
I don't disagree with what you said, Andre, but I do think we are kind of, again, we are in this, we're discussing the transition of the system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, again, we can launch all sorts of objections, but I think the goal of this episode is that we want to come up with a system kind of like in an ideal state and then reverse engineer what could be a path to it. And so everything you said was like totally like valid and reasonable, but let's see if we can actually let's see, like, again, I'm not entirely convinced that a third attractor system of international coordination is possible. So I think it's entirely possible that this idea of having efficacy without consolidation of power is inherently contradictory. Like that it could be the case that it's just a paradoxical thing and that there is no good system. But I do want to start getting into our concrete proposals. And so I had mentioned this model of the meta treaty, which would be this sort of initial catalytic event of agreeing on a core framework, right, for what these nations would agree to, the economic incentives. I think you would need an open source digital platform to actually conduct these things so we have full transparency. Without such a digital platform and without it being open source, there is no good way, right, to verify. But with technology, you can make this relatively simple. You minimize bureaucracy, and it's decentralized. Anybody can verify this open source tech, right? And you can have instances of this open source tech, let's say in each nation, in each state within each nation, say in the US. And so it becomes a lot more difficult to corrupt when you have such a level of decentralization. But I want to kind of focus on, I think, the core idea of this meta treaty model, and it's based on the idea of adaptiveness that we discussed earlier. It's the idea that we want to elect people in such a way, first of all, to make decisions that make sense for the decisions that they're making. And what I mean by that is, currently we have politicians that are not at all experts on any issue. They're just campaigning all the time. Their attention's not even on the issues. What if we had a system where it's a team of interdisciplinary members, let's say, that are drafted, and so they're not corrupted by the perverse incentives of campaigning, by lobbying, because the lobbyists don't even know who to corrupt because it's kind of a draft. And maybe the people that are eligible for this draft are people that make sense for that particular issue. So for climate change, you absolutely want climate scientists, but you also want people in industry, right? That includes even people in the oil industry because it is relevant, right? The transition away from fossil fuels is relevant. And then you want people that are not associated with either of those industries. You want
economists.
Economists. You want a wide range of people. And again, through this sort of pseudo-randomized, I don't want to say completely random because I don't want McDonald's employees to be making decisions on climate change. And I think at some point our societies have to accept the fact that not everyone is going to be included. It's a random, fair process, but it's based on merit.
It's a random, fair process that inherently includes a very large percentage of a society.
Yeah, very large percentage, exactly. Yes.
But no. I don't think you heard what I said. It's a random process that excludes
No. Well, it includes. Well, so I disagree with. Well, it depends on what you mean by large, but I think it includes a large number of people. But it includes people on merit. Like, for example, when you talk about who can run for president, like they have to be at least 35 years old.
Sure.
You can add very reasonable kind of parameters around who's eligible for such a draft. Age limit, experience as an adult, right? Like these aren't things that are inherently discriminatory, in my opinion. Like, I'm sorry, but
they are, but not all discrimination is bad.
Well, discrimination on the proper things, not on things like race, color, sex,
what
or
is the
IQ.
defining point of what's proper or not, right? I mean, to me, it just sounds like it's the creation of an international technocracy of the same credentialed masses that you have in this country that are continuously driving us these problems, and all you're doing is just elevating them to a higher status on the international stage.
I don't think so, because what I'm proposing, to be clear, could include people like plumbers, right?
Okay.
Like plumbers are eligible for this thing. It is not something that is, the parameters are not so rigid and so narrow as to exclude. You want, the point of this is to represent the society, but the point is to represent the people in society that, first of all, their brains developed. Second of all, they've worked and they've contributed to society in a meaningful way. Maybe they're an academic. Maybe they have 10 years of industry experience. Like, we're talking about broad parameters. We're talking
10
about
years
broad
of
parameters.
McDonald's experience is still experience, you know.
Well, maybe McDonald's people are. Maybe a manager at McDonald's, right, is included in this. I don't know. And I'm not saying we should be that fine-grained to say, okay, you know, if you work at a fast food shop, you're not eligible. I'm not saying that. But I think there are general parameters that you can decide upon that are not discriminatory in the ways that I think many people fear, right? Where it's like, oh, you know, it is this elite technocracy kind of thing that's happening.
So this model has its roots in something called sortition, which is it's a form of government where the public servants are randomly drafted from the population. I haven't heard of a model where it's selected from selected from a specific pool of people, but it tends to be praised pretty highly by people I respect, such as
Alex. Do you have
Magnus
any
Vinder.
examples, maybe on like a historical spectrum of like when this kind of model has been implemented, or like anything currently that might reflect that?
I'm not that familiar with it. I just know I know of the idea.
Interesting.
Actually, no, I take that back. Canadian territories have assembled, have created citizens' assemblies for making decisions around local projects and such. That seem to be successful, but that's the extent of my experience with the idea.
So, Levon, you've given a pretty good like outline of this meta treaty model. Could you maybe give like a?
I wasn't finished with it, but that's fine.
No. But could you give me like at the point you're at right now? Could you just describe like a specific scenario? Like could you simulate a way in which this model would work? Like give like a specific outline on like a how it would run. Like give me like a live fire action situation, because you've put the boundaries around it to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I haven't fully outlined it, so it wouldn't make sense for me to provide an example just yet, but I will. Let me just touch on a couple of points that I think are relevant. So you have this draft mechanism, and I even propose a variation of it, kind of where you have a draft, and then you have an election from the people that were drafted. That is, they elect people that they think would be best fit to solve these problems. And then there's another draft from those pool of people that have been elected by the initial draftees. So that provides additional redundancy and makes it even harder to corrupt. So I do think focusing on minimization of corruption is something that is absolutely necessary, as we've seen. But another aspect of this meta-treaty model is that all the nations, once agreed to this treaty, they'll be bound by very strict, strict positive incentives, economic incentives, right? And so we're talking about things like sharing resources. If a country has an abundance, like we can more equally distribute it based on their adherence to, say, certain stipulations. For example, when it comes to climate change, right? If they are, implementing more sustainable practices, maybe part of that economic incentive is other nations who have an abundance of a particular resource will, sort of contribute to a nation that is lacking in that particular resource. A sort of like ecological, insurance, a resource, economic, and ecological kind of insurance thing. There is the idea of taxing all these nations, let's say, by 1% or whatever that number is. And the nations, again, that adhere best to to what the stipulations are for a particular issue, maybe they get that money back if they stick to those metrics that have been outlined. You have to monitor these situations in some way. I don't know all the different ways that you could economically incentivize these things, maybe tariff reductions between countries that are in this treaty. And this is something, speaking of transitions, it could start out with a few nations. And if you can frame it in such a way that it's so beneficial to all members, like kind of like NATO, right? You see NATO is so beneficial to the countries in it by virtue of it's the protection that it offers, and the more countries in it, the more beneficial it becomes. I would hope that a similar thing would occur, but through pure economic incentives. And if you have the economic incentives kind of implemented in a proper way, then I think you don't need a military. And I really don't think any international system should have a military. I think that is where you've crossed the line, right? Like that is where your methods of diplomacy have totally failed. And now you have crossed that line of this is a fucking dystopia, right? Now you've got international UN soldiers,
They won't be a military.
The fantasy. How else are we going to resist
guys?
The globalists?
They won't be a military. They will be a peacekeeping force.
Right, peacekeeping. Of course. How could I be so stupid?
Yeah.
A couple of other points, and I want to make sure I'm not rambling, but I just think it's important to hit. So you want the way that this draft thing works is you create an assembly for a specific issue. So say climate change, you elect an assembly based on specific parameters that make most sense for the climate change. Again, maybe climate scientists, people in the oil industry, people in other sustainable industries, and so on and so forth, and a mix of just random people that are experienced in whatever field. So you've got this ability to form assemblies for issues, and then you cycle through the people every so often. So if people get corrupted while in this assembly, you're doing a random refreshment of the members within this every so often through the same draft mechanism that we talked about earlier. And so this, again, it adds another layer of corruption, kind of I don't know what the word I'm looking for
Insurance.
here is. Some corruption insurance or prevention mechanism, right? You're just making it more and more difficult for corruption. And again, if this is all done through open source digital platforms, it really minimizes bureaucracy and it maintains that transparency that is so hard to achieve currently with our archaic, Stone Age methods or whatever, or printing press level methods of, like, we've got paperwork, maybe we've got some online documents, but there's nothing coordinated, there's nothing transparent, there's nothing central. We don't know what the hell's going on. So that's kind of the cyclical member refreshment. And also these assemblies, again, there should be kind of this mandatory monitoring and reconvening of, like, hey, have the solutions that we've proposed, have they been effective? And if not, you are disassembled, right? Or a new set of people are elected to solve the issue.
That sounded ominous.
Yeah, disassembled. Yeah, that's a great term. I love it. So you have this, again, like dynamism, I think, that's part of this model that makes it more adaptive. And so you could simultaneously have several issues. You could have an assembly for AI. You could have an assembly for bioweapons, climate change. You can have an assembly for determining what's a fucking war crime if you needed to, right? And then I think, I more or less, I think that sums up what I was going for. So you have these different features. You've got a digital open source platform that allows us to be transparent and minimizes bureaucracy. You're bound by economic incentives, so you don't need military. You're highly dynamic and adaptive because you've got an assembly for each issue that is constantly a revolving door, but not a revolving door for corporations and politicians, but a revolving door for citizens and members of this assembly, right? So you're maintaining that constant representation of everyday people, and you're minimizing the likelihood of corruption through that revolving door principle. You've got a draft mechanism that is very unlikely to be corrupted or is very difficult to corrupt. And so all these features together, I think they create a system that by no means is it perfect. By no means is this like the ultimate ideal system for the rest of the history of humanity. But I think you could at least take some of these ideas. If you apply it to our current system, think about how much better it would be. I think it's clearly, there are aspects of the system that are clearly superior to what we've got anywhere in the world.
So just kind of now delve in just a little bit deeper and give a simulation of this system in action. Pick one of the elements of the Metacrisis and just talk it out.
Okay, Alex, do you want to do this, or do you want me to go ahead? I've been talking a lot, so I want to make sure I give everyone a chance. But I'm happy to go through it. But
sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
and I'll weigh in as needed.
So there's a few different ways this could work depending on how the system is specifically structured. But to take the most popular topic of this conversation, climate change, as an example. So we need to create an assembly to solve climate change. Thus far, Levon has described a system where we then decide the parameters of who needs to be on this assembly. This could involve economists. This could involve climate scientists. It could involve people in various relevant industries. And also, we would want to have representation from specific regions. Because people in different cultures and different regions will have insights.
So let me add something to that. I think every country sends they have members that are part of this assembly.
Every country.
And in every single country, well, every country that's in the treaty, right? But assuming ideally, like all countries are in it, it's
Sure.
the ideal state. But like, so yeah, every country would send people that they have drafted. And again, this is done in a decentralized fashion. So you can't have someone corrupting like all these processes, right? Like maybe someone corrupts the process in the Congo. Maybe someone corrupts the process in Sri Lanka, in Burkina Faso, as you love to talk about.
Hands off
Andre.
Ouagadougou, man.
Right.
Hands off.
Armenia, whatever, like Mongolia. Like you've got corruption in a few countries, but we have 195 countries, and there's a lot of fucking people on this planet. 8 billion and counting. So the idea that somebody could corrupt like enough people, right? It's like even if you've corrupt like 10% of the people in these election assemblies somehow, like you can't realistically corrupt everyone. But I mean I could be wrong. Maybe new technology emerges that allows you to do that. But based on our current understanding of how things work, it would be incredibly difficult. Alex, please go ahead.
So we've also touched on financial transparency. I think public officials, their financial records should be completely open to the public. All the money they spend, all the money they receive, and all the assets they acquire and have, including for a period of after they leave public office. So that also kind of adds to the resilience to corruption, I think. But yeah, you've formed this assembly. And from this sortition, this assembly, they then have, within some parameters, unilateral authority. Like whatever they say goes. If they say we need to do a thing, we have to do that thing. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it.
Anybody that's part of the treaty agrees within the framework of the treaty that with the assembly rules, you're going to, pass laws to limit carbon output or something like that.
Right. Correct.
Okay.
And of course, there are positive incentives for following these edicts, like Levon touched on, like potential tax credits, tariff reductions, providing resources from other nations, that kind of thing. And then I would also want to have a element of like maybe another assembly, or maybe a portion of the assembly that is specifically their entire job is to make sure that the meta system isn't harmed by whatever the assembly decides. Because the last thing we want is for one of these assemblies to create new feedback loops that destroy the incentives landscape again. So there would need to be an assembly that is entirely focused on the meta system.
Call it
treaty.
like the administrative assembly. Right?
Yeah.
But it's a permanent.
The day-to-day still works. Okay.
And it's a permanent assembly in the sense that the assembly is permanent, but the members are still cycled through like all the other ones, right? So
sure.
Yes. It has the same kind of checks to it as any
same,
other assembly.
Same model, just a different goal. And every other assembly has to run their ideas through this other assembly first, and then from there it's unilaterally they have unilateral authority. So that's the way I see it working at a high level. And then, of course, at some point, maybe after a certain amount of time, or when after a certain project milestone is complete, we then do the sortition again, potentially informed by the existing members, or maybe potentially informed by the same framework that elected these members in the first place, depending on how we want to hash out the specifics of the system.
So, okay, you're trying to address climate change. Let's take that as an example.
Sure.
It's a big nebulous concept. So let's maybe narrow it down to like one of the like sub issues. Like we talked about decreasing carbon emissions. Let's say that is the sub objective that we're trying to achieve in this rotation, right? So within the Meta Treaty Organization, you have a council to address
assembly.
Let's call
it an assembly to maintain the
council's
terms.
a little bit too like hooded robes and daggers. Yeah, okay. So you have an assembly that addresses climate change. They accept that this rotation is going to be about decreasing carbon outputs, right? Boom. You call for a draft. all the member states of the treaty, they, in whatever way they've pulled together a group of individuals that are drafted from, they all send their representatives to the Assembly for Climate to discuss, debate, organize around how to decrease global carbon emissions, right? The Assembly generates a solution that all factories need to I don't know, work in like a cyclical schedule, which I'm bullshitting. Like, I don't know what this actually is, but let's say like they need to work in a cyclical series of operations in order to decrease carbon output. They pass it. It moves up to the arbitrating administrative assembly. The administrative assembly says, per this treaty, we now mandate that all member states must enact this policy to reduce carbon, right? At which, because everybody's signed on to it, every member state agrees to cycle the operations of their factories inside the country. It goes to the legislation because it's binding. It goes into effect. And then, in theory, after 6 months, you start measuring carbon output, and it is indeed decreased. Boom, success, right?
Sure.
So, I think this is good, and I like the idea of the assembly structure. I like the idea for an organization that everybody is committed to attending. I think that's a really strong point. I just don't. One of the biggest issues that the United Nations faced when it was organized after World War II is the commitment to abide by the resolutions that the United States, that the United Nations, I was a Freudian, so that the United Nations sets in as an organization. In the U.S. in particular, there was the U.S. almost didn't join the United Nations because there was a debate over the constitutionality of embracing it and arbitrating international organizations ruling on something, right? To this day, we still have a hard time in participating in some international institutions as a country. The United States is not a party member to, I believe, the International Criminal Court, because by the U.S. Constitution, an outside organization cannot rule on the fate of a U.S. citizen, right? Which is why, like, after the Iraq War, the war on terror blowback, there's been no prosecution on an international standard of some of the things that happened. Now, I think your model is great, and I think it's strong. I just, the one hurdle that we're going to have to get across is how to get countries, especially that are currently global powers, to buy into a treaty that would willingly decrease their authority and their outlook.
So let me try to answer that as best as I can. So again, I do think we are heading into that territory of transition, which is perfectly a logical place to go, and we will need to explore that. I don't know if we should in this episode, but the what I'm kind of envisioning here is that the UN currently does not have the proper incentive structure. Right, that is truly missing, and that is why these resolutions are like meaningless.
Well, no, in theory, the incentive structures are there. The UN can pass kind of sanctions packages, for instances. And
but how can you elaborate? Because these sanctions seem to be kind of very like mild, and there's easy ways to skirt around them. Right?
They're mild and they're easy to skirt around as long as one of the Security Council members is willing to shield the target country from the consequences of those things.
So you have a systemic flaw in that a single veto from a permanent member of the Security Council, or any member of the Security Council. Is it any member or just the permanent, like the 5 members?
That's a good question. Know? I think it's any.
Yeah, it's very easy to.
If it's good luck. So that is a critical systemic flaw, but I think what you want to get away from, like, very punitive methods. I think we can figure out better incentives, and what we've been thinking on this meta treaty model is that the economic incentives are positive based. Like, instead of being punitive, they're like they are like, hey, you will actually benefit from abiding by this. So it becomes this self-reinforcing loop where now actually it's in my self-interest. I'm not doing it because I have to. I'm doing it because it's better for me to do it. So if you can align these economic incentives in such a way, again, it could start out small. If you want to touch on the transition piece again, if it starts out with a few nations, like let's say Canada, and I think there is some sort of trade agreements, right? But let's say Europe, Canada, Mexico, Argentina, and Spain, Germany, France, UK kind of were like they started this treaty along with, like, let's say Japan and Korea, right? Like they all just started this treaty. They were the founding members of this treaty, whatever. They're going to start to gain like these recursive benefits through the mutual economic self-interest. That again, if properly outlined and implemented, that's what it would lead to, like economic self-interest. And other countries will see it. Other countries potentially will be outcompeted by these nations because now they are more resilient because they kind of are benefiting from one another. They'll be incentivized to join it, and over time, this thing would grow. In theory, again, this is pure speculation. Obviously, like it could totally fail and just be like a completely ineffective. It could literally be worse than the United Nations. It's possible. I doubt it, but it could be. I can't predict anything like that. But you create this positive incentive structure so that again, it's not punitive. We're not punishing nations that are not abiding by the things, but they're not getting the benefit, right? And so when you see that it becomes you're trying to reframe this into a non-zero situation, right? A non-zero sum situation. Because right now it's very much zero sum. It's very much if China has this thing, if China has this benefit, then maybe the U.S. doesn't. But the best things that we've developed throughout our geopolitical history has been the things that have been kind of mutually beneficial, which have been economics.
Mutually detrimental too. Mutually assured
Right.
destruction
Well,
is probably like the
also, fragility in a globalized, supply chain and all that. But like, I mean, there's a lot of complications. But again, does this kind of answer your question, Andre? Like the idea of incentives, or do you think that this is a genuine thing that still needs to be maybe
and again, I
thought
think
about some more?
If this is not something that, if we're not going to be discussing implementation this time around, maybe it's not productive to even voice it. But I think that some of the most difficult things this model is going to run up against is there's always going to be even within like the founding model, right? Where like you have a handful of countries that decide, yeah, okay, we're gonna embark on this, right? And that's kind of how, let's say, the European Union worked, right? At first, it was France, Germany, England agreed to certain tariffs removals on like trading coal and steel or something like that. But as the model grew, you kind of have this problem where one country, especially if we're discussing like economic incentives, and I see your point about not being punitive, but like you want to join an organization because there's a net benefit to joining as opposed to you're going to get punished for not joining. One country is always going to end up footing the bill for the others. And it's going to, in the name of internationalism and kind of co-prosperity, sure, if that's the political culture that you have within your country. And for a while, let's say in the European Union, Germany had a political system in which they were okay in sort of acting as maybe the economic nerve center of an organization, where if the EU passed like a distributed resource campaign, right, where money was flowed out to Romania so Romania could rebuild its power plants in a more efficient way, the nature of politics in Germany supported that. Yeah, okay, like of course Germany would be paying into that kind of program.
So
right?
Do we not have examples historically like NATO where US is footing a larger portion of the bill?
Exactly. And it's causing a lot of problems internal to the United States, as you see right now, where by the free rider problem, right? Where, yeah, the United States has historically footed the bill. Granted, the U.S. has benefited from it because the U.S. has like a firm military foothold on Europe.
Yeah, it's unclear actually. Like I'm not sure. I'm not sure actually how we even evaluate whether it's been a net benefit or negative. It's not clear to me because there has been, there's been obviously strategic benefits from a military standpoint, but also economic in terms of trade, and also
Well, it's been an economic
general world stability. You could even, the U.S. known for destabilizing, maybe stabilizing certain areas that it sees as important to the extent that it can. I don't know. I genuinely don't know how you can. I don't know how you even make that assessment, like whether it's been a net negative or benefit. You would have to kind of rerun kind of history to see what happens if there wasn't a NATO, right? Like, maybe fucking Finland and Lithuania are part of Russia. I mean, I don't know.
I think the way that this would work, and I think the model, like as a theoretical foundation, is strong, right? But again, I guess I feel like implementation is an important topic for all circumstances, and it has to be woven into a conversation about it. But I think you would have to change internal political culture for every participating member of this kind of meta treaty organization.
I think for any new system, that's necessary. I think
the only way you could do that is
mm-hmm.
from. I think the model you were describing is like the later stage of an effort that starts at the grassroots level, that starts at like individual, localized, almost like mirroring the Catholic Church to a certain extent, that will bring about a cultural and or a political shift internally to a participant nation, which will then drive it to accept conditions that, again, the NATO free rider problem, right? Where if you have an industrial powerhouse country that will be willing to potentially overcommit resources as compared to other members by nature of the fact it's a wealthier country, if there is a political culture internal to that country that's willing to accommodate that. Again, Germany and after World War II, they felt kind of bad about the shit they did in the 1940s. So they were willing to kind of maybe play more of like a sponsorship role, right? But anyways, Alex, go ahead.
Here's the for what it's worth, I totally agree, Andrey.
Andre.
So this is the slight paradox, if that's the right word, of bottom up versus top down. For a proper bottom up approach, like you were describing, we need to know what we're shooting for in order to aim the cultural enlightenment in the right direction. And then in order to do the top down approach, we need to actually have buy-in from the culture that in the first place.
Top down is effective for management. Top down is effective for management and administration. Bottom up is necessary and integral in organizing. And I think to organize something like this, you must start at the baseline of a grassroots level.
I want to counter something Alex said, though, because you said that we need to know where we're going in order to get there through the bottom-up approach, which is interesting because, I mean, that is kind of like how we've framed this episode to some extent. But I'm in the middle of Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb, which is a fucking insanely good book.
It's very good.
But he talks about how actually that's a terrible strategy and how the method of trial and error produces better results. Like to not know where you're going, but to simply have the options to choose where you could go and learn from the mistakes in a more iterative process leads to better results than the sort of,
I think, it's a difference in framing, I think. When I say know where you're going, I'm specifically referring to the meta system of valuing recursion and self-modification.
Yeah.
So, I agree in principle.
It's just also because just a real quick point on that Nassim Taleb like shits on all these central planning systems like the Soviet Union and everything. And of course, like all those arguments make sense. But if we were to actually look at all these systems, all these historical examples that we have, they've all been like the US is clearly like the best one, and they kind of thought of it before, right? And then they implemented it. Now, of course, there was some iteration, and of course, iteration is part of this meta treaty system that we've talked about anyhow. So it is a feature of it, but most systems have been fucking terrible, right? Like you can look at the system design and based on what we know now, sure, okay, it's easier in hindsight, but there's clear flaws in them. The U.S. system has performed, relatively speaking, well. But even looking at that system as it was, at the time that it was developed, I mean, you could see many of these problems, right? And you can see a lot of these problems in the capitalistic, like Karl Marx has identified, not to like promote Marxism or anything, but like Marx identified very accurately like the problems of capitalism. And so, yeah, I think I've kind of sidetracked myself here. What was Andre? I think you were talking about the implementation of this meta treaty model and these issues that it would face. And you were talking about...
I was saying that the model you're describing is the consequence of a more concerted effort. Like you could only bring sure, you could organize this today, but the only way you could bring about an effective model, and I think effective in particular is around the lack of punitive elements, right? As like maybe focusing on a reward system, that is only possible through a series of steps that need to be achieved beforehand.
Yeah,
and it's this notion that, again, we don't have to promote Marxism or socialism, but if we look at them, but if you treat it as an international political, however, if you treat it as an international political phenomenon, right? Especially like the early socialist movements, which were still aspiring to global revolution, right? Global revolution would create a series of, it would be a homogenous economic / political culture on a global basis. And then in that kind of homogenous approach, you could break down the barriers of capital. You could promote certain policies that everybody would accept, things like that, right? And I think what you're talking about is not unlike socialism. You are promoting a global political movement whose ultimate objective is to create the sort of meta-treaty organization that would be effective in addressing the meta-crisis, right? So in essence, we need to have nerve cells of political will across all member states, so all countries, that are going to be willing to play ball with something like this. And the only way you could do that is to start trying to change the political systems of all countries from within to accommodate for that.
Well, here's a few points I want to just quickly make, and I'm sure, Alex, you want to say a few things too. One is it's not just a grassroots political movement. I mean, it is, but it's not just sparked by like this just utopian desire to create the system. It's also like there will be shit hitting the fan. Hopefully not severe enough, but severe enough. Hopefully not severe enough to like totally destroy us, but severe enough to get our attention. And I think that I think we don't want to underestimate the role that catastrophic, let's say mildly catastrophic events can cause in propelling change, right? Like again, like Nassim Taleb talks about. I'm a shill for Nassim Taleb, but he wrote the book Black Swan, and I think there's like this unknowns that could happen, and that could be there could be black swan events that propel us in this direction faster than you might expect, and in a way that a mere grassroots cultural movement, kind of on its own in a vacuum without the added pressure of more catastrophic events, would be insufficient.
But the nature of your organization is one that already accepts that black swan events will happen by nature of the consequence of the Metacrisis, right? I think that yes,
Right, but you need that tangible like pain, the tangible, suffering and impact on the planet to act. Like people are just really shitty at acting. I mean, like you're right, like there's enough evidence when it comes to like what's going on with climate change, but it has to be worse. It has to be like over.
But this
Like-
is sorry, Alex, go ahead.
I forget if Nassim Taleb said this in his book Black Swan or not, but I remember someone saying how you can't predict black swans, but what you can do is you can maximize your ability to take advantage of them by giving yourself as many options and surface area as possible, so to speak. And I think a good grassroots organization that spreads across the world would be in a good position to take advantage of such black swan events. Like if you can get the seeds of this idea planted, then as widely as possible.
We got a fucking Bolshevik on the show. He's just
then when such an event occurs, all the necessary preconditions are already in place
it's not
to kickstart.
To benefit, it's not to profit, it's to be prepared. No. Like
yeah.
I think that is the prescription for a grassroots movement is you establish a political movement which is preparing itself to deal with the consequences of these existential threats humanity is facing at an unprecedented scale. It's a movement. Yeah. We're essentially advocating for an international prepper movement. Just prepper from like maybe a spiritual, like philosophical standpoint, as opposed to like, oh my God, we got to go get some cabbage in the basement or something like that. You know, I think if we're going back to the whiteboard approach, right? If we're picking and choosing the strongest elements of successful internationalist drives, we do need to look at the Socialist International as a guiding way in which you can create individual action groups or committees or reading groups or whatever you call them at the hyperlocal level, right? So you have this overarching agreement, right? You've created, I don't know, a society of sorts that will then shepherd in the introduction of the Meta Treaty Organization, right? You accept that there are, Alex, I love when you're talking about, hey, transparency is a very important thing for this, right? You need to know what the public serving officials are doing, et cetera, right? So you have some key tenets, almost as a political movement would have key tenets, right? It doesn't have to be socialism. If you look at like fascism or something like that, right? They also had some like weird zany way of trading best practices. But if you have membership distributed in chapters from New York City to Bangalore, India, where members get together and meet and discuss, and then meet on an international level to discuss, as the socialists did with their international gatherings before the 1930s, you have a way to kind of acknowledge that, okay, this is an international movement. We have clear political objectives we want to achieve. Let's start acting at the level of not even the country, but the locality, right? Like what could be done at the city council level to ensure that in X amount of time, we will achieve the objective of the Meta Treaty Organization.
Well,
one last thing, just one last point I want to make. Whereas socialism was a utopian ideology, it was a utopian movement to it was a movement to a utopian future where we kind of achieve this like abstract revolutionary concept. This would be an ideology with a pragmatic resolution, where you have a pragmatic objective at the end of it, that you are working and struggling to achieving the creation of this sort of organization, which will be able to effectively address the meta crisis. So it removes this like utopian, at times nihilistic approach to these sorts of things, but it maintains the idealism and the drive to create something bigger and better.
You're right, and
I love that.
That's the key distinction. This is we're trying to move towards a system that is able to produce the solutions we need, as opposed to like the socialist revolution where it already had the solution in mind. Right, the solution was socialism.
Yeah, I like that.
But the solution of socialism it wasn't a pragmatic or realistic concept. It was a philosophical interpretation of history. Whereas what is being claimed for here is that the revolution, and I think what we need to acknowledge is what you're prescribing is in fact a revolutionary model. You're trying to revolutionize the way
Of
that
course.
nation states think. So, but the end goal of this revolution is not a abstract arcane concept. The end goal is a pragmatic,
Right.
realistic institution that can function. That's the revolution
That
that's
too,
being
yes,
advocated
absolutely. I think that another kind of practical benefit is, when you talk about this bottom-up approach, is that you can actually pick certain elements of like this. First of all, this model is very scalable, which is exactly what you would want from an adaptive model, right?
Right.
It can scale.
Right.
Obviously, when you talk about it at the international level, you are meeting a boundary condition. So maybe there's some slight tinkering there, but more or less, it's pretty scalable. But even beyond the scalability, like you can pick certain elements of this. For example, the draft mechanism to get decision makers into office. Like you could pluck that out of this model and put it in the U.S. system right now instead of our kind of representative democracy, right? Like you could, in theory, you could do that. So you still have people in Congress. You still have a president. Like you could elect the president through this model. Like imagine that. Like imagine getting rid of fucking campaigning, making lobbying like completely impossible or impractical, making it so that our lack of an educated populace isn't as much of an issue as it is now. Like you can truly bypass many of the existing issues by just virtue of implementing just one of these components of the meta treaty model.
Well,
right?
but I think the idea isn't to bypass; it's to reform and change.
Sure.
We don't want to bypass.
I'm just saying in theory, like if you implemented it tomorrow, then I do think it would be interesting. But you're right. There is, you have to have a holistic approach. You can't just be like, we've implemented this system and this is how it's going to be. Like it has to emerge. It has to be a part of culture, and it has to be tied to the economics. Like so long as capitalism so long as unbridled capitalism is the driving economic model of the world, actually, I don't think you will ever see this model.
No,
like,
no, and that's what I was getting.
Absolutely will not happen.
I think one of the enemies of this sorts of movement will be unchecked finance,
economic
capitalism.
Interest.
That is one of the enemies that we will have to fight on a local level too, and that's the process of changing the systems internal to all member states. Is the struggle to reform economics as such. I mean, it's not like all it would take in the U.S. for this to at least have like a modicum of success is to pass campaign finance laws. Like really, that's what it would take is to remove corporate influence over the political process, so you can actually start injecting some new energy and thought into it that's not coming from a candidate that's backed by massive amounts of money coming from shadowy organizations. So in a way, it is also going to be a struggle against the current economic institutions. So, I mean, let me kind of, again, offer up kind of a pragmatic scenario, right? So let's say the three of us are the first members of this global political movement. Congratulations. So, we're probably not going to be able to accomplish this in the U.S. with just the three of us, but maybe on a smaller scale. Like, okay, fine. We move to
Burkina
Faso. There you go. Thank you. We start in Ouagadougou. That's the only city I know in Burkina Faso. We start a local chapter.
Isn't that the only city in Burkina Faso?
Man, don't disrespect them. They're doing awesome things in Burkina Faso nowadays.
Hey, in Armenia, we only have like one real city. So
you know what? Fuck it. Let's talk about Armenia, right? Like we'll go. We move to Armenia, right? We start a chapter in Yerevan for this sort of political movement. Whatever, we have our like list of things we want to accomplish, right? We start organizing on a neighborhood level in Yerevan. We get some people elected to Yerevan City Council, whatever. Eventually we get a whatever equivalent of like a minister in power, right? We're able to pass legislation that, X, Y, and Z happens. And then eventually Armenia is prepared to enter into the fold into this sort of model. Fuck it. Armenia is the founding member because that's where this sort of movement has been effective. The same model, like as it's perpetuating, right? You're getting more and more members. Somebody travels out to Canada, starts a chapter in Toronto. Same thing happens, and boom, like All of a sudden, Canada, after 10 years, is ripe to join this kind of organization. Then you have a handful of countries that get together and form this sort of a meta-treaty organization. Then you could start implementing some of the carrot approach, right? All of a sudden, Armenia is far more economically competitive because they're given privileged access to markets in Canada. And then it starts proliferating in that way.
And this can actually happen a lot quicker than people think because of the internet, because of the influence of social media and the way that our algorithm. I mean, like, imagine if you change the algorithm so they promote like healthier conversation, better ideas, and all of a sudden, these things are getting the millions of views instead of cat videos or Alex Jones videos. Like Alex Jones, Alex Jones, according to, there was a study done on YouTube, it was recommended 8 billion, like his content was recommended like 8 billion plus times or something.
Right.
Imagine if this idea was recommended 8 billion plus times.
Yeah.
Like, are you kidding me?
I
So,
mean,
like, we have the technology. Like, think about how quickly the U.S. was polarized by social media. In a decade, we've got QAnon as like the lead authority on, on one side of the political aisle, and then we've got woke, crazy shit going on the left. So it can happen relatively quickly. It is possible, but I think this is a great maybe topic to address maybe in a part 2. Like, okay, we have our model, a potential model. How could we actually get there? Like, what is a potential transition to this model? And what are the things that we would have to overcome? Ultimately, I would also like us to explore what the unintended consequences of such a system would be, ways that it could be corrupted, and the flaws and the perverse incentives that it might have that we can't see yet. But maybe that's another part. But I think thinking through the transition would be a very interesting exercise as well. What do you guys think?
And I mean, what would the platform actually be? If indeed this is the start of a political movement, what things are going to be the unifying principles that you would want to see across the board? So what would make a country ripe for membership in a meta-treaty organization? Is it transparency of the political process? Is it effective checks on how businesses operate? And I mean, I just have to say,
what happens if Saudi Arabia wants to join?
Well, I mean, Saudi Arabia should be able to join because, oh my gosh, it has oil fields and money.
What do you do? But what do you do when like you've got these like human rights violations? Do you create a model where it's a lot more open and you accept them, and then you hope that by them being a part of this, that over time they will change, or do you say no? You need to adhere to strict human rights standards. Otherwise, you can't join.
You have a movement inside of Saudi Arabia that, ultimately speaking, topples the current system.
There is no movements in Saudi Arabia.
But I mean, sure, but like maybe you start with the underground, right? You start. I mean, like,
as long as there are human.
Okay, yeah.
As long as there are human. As long as there are human minds, there's always a movement.
Right.
But I mean, check this out. Here's actually a potential for like a very catastrophic scenario with this treaty model. It's you start to isolate certain nations because maybe they don't meet the certain criteria. Then they form their own, meta-treaty alternative model, and then now you've got a very tense situation. Maybe half the world is on one side, half the world is on another model, and now you've got bigger stakes, more terrifying. Like, imagine if they go to these two organizations or these two groups go to war. You could inadvertently set off a worse, a more existentially risky situation.
But the nature of political change is struggle, and I think that like. Honestly, the implementation of this kind of model, I think at some point it will lead to violence. And it's the question over, is violence, like do we need a period of violence to bring about the necessary change to save humanity? I'm realizing that like in the span of an hour and a half, we basically just talked through the creation of like an Illuminati that's going to manipulate governments and force them into this kind of organization. But
nice. It's the Illuminati.
Word.
Nice.
Yeah, but I mean, is nice practical? Like, do we have to be ruthless? What do we do when the ideology that, like, let's say you create the sort of political movement and the ideology starts getting suppressed? where Saudi
Yeah.
Arabia passes laws that you cannot be part of the Meta Treaty movement. Do you fight? Do you advocate for the violent overthrow of government X, Y, and Z in order to will into existence the Meta Treaty Organization? Are the threats that humanity is facing from the Metacrisis so grave that we need to take into consideration that maybe a conflict is necessary to avoid to address that?
I mean,
Where is violence in this movement?
This gets into, you know, the virtue ethics versus like utilitarian ethics of like,
Mhm.
well, it's ultimately better, or maybe it's consequentialism. I don't know, but virtue ethics says, you know, like, you know, just do what's right in that moment,
Right.
and maybe that leads to violence, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe what's right is not to do it through violence; it's through diplomacy. I mean, it's a complete headache, and
But if diplomacy is a system that's already exploited by the nature of power politics on a global stage, if you're trying to lead a revolution, maybe you have to lead a revolution. And maybe it does come down to, at some point, your movement has to be able to
eat the rich. That's it. I mean, there's the answer.
To a certain extent, it sounds like we're almost like trying to edit and reform, and we're not advocating for socialism, but we're taking the internationalist approach, and we're clearly acknowledging maybe some pieces of the Marxist analysis over how society functions, but we're not Marxist. You're not saying you're a Marxist, but you can take bits and pieces from these things that were objective truths and integrate it into a new movement to address the metacrisis. I mean,
Sure.
I'm talking like the fucking cults where it's like, yeah, the space Jesus is going to come down and we all have to like drink this Kool-Aid to make it on the flying saucer. But like, I think,
well, it's the best kind of cult, right? It's a fully transparent, mutually beneficial cult. So
right.
there you
That's
go.
what they all
Maybe-
say. That's what they all like.
Maybe the real space Jesus were the podcasters we recorded with along the way.
Yeah.
Space,
Yeah.
yeah.
But it sounds
Podcasting
like we
is
have
actually the platform for the meta treaty
Yeah.
model to spread.
I mean, but to the point you made, like, hey, in the past 200 years, if any political movement had the reach of the internet at their disposal, like, what would it have led to? Like the temperance movement in America, right? Carry Nation, like banning alcoholic consumption. Like they managed to get an amendment passed in the Constitution, but what if they had TikTok? Like, what would that have done? You know, like if anything, you're describing a game of politics in a completely like supercharged environment. Like we haven't really explored and we haven't seen the mass proliferation of an idea through like a political idea through a social media channel, really, you know?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, and then that's kind of like the immediate hurdle is because these algorithms are, you know, set in such a way that they are counterproductive to the goals that we are trying to reach. But they don't have to be that way, right? Like, you know, it's tech doesn't have to be that bad. And we see this, you know, with the difference of the content that kids in kids in China see on TikTok versus the kids here. So it's entirely possible. It's just, again, this is one of the paradoxes of the multipolar trap issue that we're trying to solve. Is, you know, to avoid these crises, you need to solve multipolar traps, and then to solve a multipolar trap, you kind of need to solve a multipolar trap. There's like a, and again, maybe it's a pseudo, maybe it's just appearance of circularity, but that's kind of how I viewed it in my head. It's like you have these bigger multipolar traps, but to solve them, you have these more miniature ones, right? And I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how we do it, but let's save this discussion for how we transition to this meta treaty model for a part 2. I think we covered a lot of ground. Maybe we can refine the system even more as we take some time to think through things. But we would love to hear from everybody. You know, what do you guys think about this model? And you know, we'll post a Google Doc link to a more formal outline of this model if people want to look at it, share their thoughts, share it around. Definitely, but let us know. Like, comment, subscribe, as always. Alex, thank you very much for being our guest.
It was great to
again,
have you, Alex.
If people want to reach
Good to
you
be
or
here,
whatever, we'll have your information below, but feel free to add anything again. Any sort of social media, whatever.
Sure. Yeah, no. You can find me on most social media under Alex Hedtke, and would love to connect with anyone who enjoys these ideas. I also run the local effective altruism and rationalist communities, which are sources of great wisdom, in my opinion, and would recommend checking them out.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for listening, and we will be back next time.
Catch you on the next one. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, guys.